Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture is on Kinesis and this is a high-level overview of Kinesis. Kinesis has started appearing in the Certified Solutions Architect Associate exam. So we've created this section to give you a high-level overview and then some practical hands-on experience with Kinesis. So, what is streaming data? Let's start with streaming data because in order to understand Kinesis, you have to understand streaming data. So streaming data is data that is generated continuously by thousands of data sources, which typically send the data records simultaneously and in small sizes, and we're talking about kilobytes. So this could be purchases from online stores, for example. So think of Amazon.com. People are buying stuff on there every single second, and that generates streaming data. So that would be the transaction, that would be the product that they've bought, etc. Stock prices could be an example of streaming data. Game data, so this could be like Angry Birds. As the player is playing Angry Birds, that device or that application could be streaming data back to the central servers about what the user is doing and what their scores are, etc. Social network data is another example of streaming data. So every time you go onto Facebook and you update your status or you post something to your friends' walls, data could then be streamed. And then a really good example of streaming data is geospatial data. So just think of Uber.com. I'm actually recording this right out the front of Uber's offices in San Francisco right now. I'm in town for a tech conference and I'm staying right next door to them. I'm actually looking at their building right now. So geospatial data, if you think about when you're using Uber, your device is connected to the internet and it's constantly saying where your Uber driver is and where you are, and then it's interrogating the maps to give you the fastest route possible to where it is you want to go. So that is another good example of streaming data. Another final example would be IoT and the sensor data that IoT collects. So this could be sensors all around the world monitoring temperatures, for example. So what is Kinesis? Well, Kinesis is a platform on AWS that you send your streaming data to. It makes it easy to load and analyze streaming data and also provides you the ability to build your own custom applications for your business needs. So there's three core Kinesis services. There's Kinesis Streams, there's Kinesis Firehose, and then there's Kinesis Analytics. And in the exam, you're going to be given a whole bunch of different scenario questions, and you have to identify which service you should use in order to best fit the scenario. So you need to have a key understanding of the different aspects of the Kinesis service. So why don't we start with Kinesis Streams, because it's the easiest place to start. So down off to the left, we've got an EC2 instance, we've got mobile phones, we've got laptops, we could have physical computers, we've got IoT, and these are data producers. So these are the ones that are producing the data for us. They are then sending this data over to Kinesis Streams. Now, Kinesis Streams basically stores this data. By default, it's stored for 24 hours, but you can increase this for 7 days. Now, this data is actually stored in these things called shards, and I'll explain what they are in the next slide. But basically, your data is sent to Kinesis, it's stored in shards, and by default, it's stored in those shards for 24 hours, but you can increase that to 7-day retention. Once the data is stored in the shard, you then have a fleet of EC2 instances, which are called your data consumers. And they basically take the data from the shard and turn it into something useful. So it might be aggregating the data. It might be running sentiment analysis on social media feeds. It might be some kind of algorithm you've got to predict the stock market or to predict the cost of commodities, etc. And once your data consumers have done their calculations, they can then send that data to be stored in a variety of AWS services. So things like DynamoDB, S3, Elastic MapReduce, Redshift, etc. So quickly just on streams, Kinesis Streams consist of shards, and a shard basically gives you 5 transactions per second for reads and up to a maximum total data read rate of 2 megabytes per second, and up to 1,000 records per second for writes, and up to a total data write rate of 1 megabyte per second, and that includes your partition keys. Now don't worry, you don't need to remember those figures going into the exams, but just understand what a shard is, and you can have multiple shards in a stream. So the data capacity of your stream is basically a function of the number of shards that you specify for the stream, or the total capacity of the stream is the sum of all of the shards that you have within that stream. So that's the architecture of Kinesis streams. So what is Kinesis Firehose? Well, Kinesis Firehose is very similar in that we have our data producers. So we've got our EC2 instances. That could be a web fleet of EC2 instances, like Amazon.com, for example. It could be your mobile devices when you're using Uber. It could be your laptop. It could be IoT. And they're sending the data into Kinesis Firehose. So the cool thing about Kinesis Firehose is that you don't have to worry about shards, you don't have to worry about streams, you don't have to worry about manually adding in shards to keep up with your data, etc. It's completely automated. And you don't even have to worry about data consumers going in and mining that data. You can analyze that data using Lambda in real time. And once that data has been analyzed, you can then send it over directly to S3. Now, the actual analytics of that data is completely optional. The other thing about Kinesis Firehose is that there's no like automatic data retention window. So in Kinesis streams, you can retain data by default for 24 hours, but you can extend that up to 7 days. Firehose doesn't work like that. Essentially, as soon as the data comes into Firehose, it's either analyzed using Lambda, or it's sent directly on to S3 or other locations. So what other locations? Well, it could be things like Redshift. If you are sending data to Redshift via the Firehose, you have to write to S3 first, and then that data is then copied in to Redshift from S3. And you can also use Kinesis Firehose to send things over to Elasticsearch cluster. So you can also write your data directly into Elasticsearch cluster. So Firehose is a very automated way of doing Kinesis. So we'll just compare. This is Kinesis streams again. So you've got your data producers. They're sending the data into the streams. The streams consists of shards. The data itself is contained for between 24 hours or up to 7 days, but by default it's 24 hours. Your consumers then go in and consume that data, analyze it, do whatever it is that you need that to do to transform that data, and then your consumers can send that data onto things like DynamoDB, S3, Elastic MapReduce, or Redshift. But when we're using Firehose, for example, it's completely automated, so you don't need to worry about your data consumers. You just send it to Firehose. Firehose then sends it to S3. You can optionally go ahead and analyze that data using Lambda, but it's a lot more automated, and you don't have to worry about the management of shards and data retention within Kinesis itself. So let's move on to Kinesis Analytics. This can come up just as a high-level concept as to what it is. So down here we've got our Kinesis Firehose and we've got our Kinesis streams. Kinesis Analytics allows you to run SQL queries of that data as it exists within Firehose or streams, and then you can use that SQL query to store that data inside S3, Redshift, or Elasticsearch cluster. So it's essentially a way of analyzing the data that's inside Kinesis using SQL type querying languages, and you can use it across both Kinesis streams as well as Kinesis Firehose. So what are my exam tips going into the exam about Kinesis? Well, you need to know the difference between Kinesis streams and Kinesis Firehose. You're going to be given scenario questions and you must choose the most relevant service. So just remember the core architectural differences. If you see a question talking about shards, you know straight away that that's going to be Kinesis streams because Firehose doesn't have shards. Whereas if it's talking about analyzing data automatically using Lambda and not having to worry about data consumers, then that's going to be Kinesis Firehose. Also understand at a high level just what Kinesis Analytics is. So now we're just going to quickly do a hands-on lab so you can see Kinesis in action. We're going to use a CloudFormation template to build this out. So if you've got the time, join me in the next lecture. Thank you.